Jack had always chased logic. A man of systems, code, and coffee-fueled routines. But on a clear morning off the coast of Indonesia, he boarded a boat to forget. He thought it was a peaceful tour, a break from screens and stress. But when they dropped him off on an island that wasn't on the map and never came back, the break became a nightmare. What if your dream escape was someone else's ritual? And once you're chosen, can you ever go back? Jack Monroe needed to disappear. After 10 straight years in tech, building software that made other people rich and himself miserable, he booked the cheapest flight out of San Francisco with one goal: to lose himself. The office politics, the endless debugging, the empty apartment, it had all started to close in like walls. Indonesia looked like the furthest place from all that. He found a private, unlisted boat tour online. The website was minimal, but the photos of untouched beaches and turquoise waters were convincing. The guide, a man named Rudy, promised Jack an authentic journey to places no tourist goes. Jack didn't ask questions. He clicked book now, packed light, and told no one. When he arrived in Labuan Bajo, a port town bustling with tourists and locals, he felt the weight of home lift off his shoulders. At the dock, Rudy and 2 other men were waiting beside a long, narrow boat. The vessel was weathered but clean. Jack asked about the other passengers. Rudy smiled. No others today. Lucky you. Jack boarded, pleased with his solo luck. As they set off, he leaned against the boat's railing, breathing in freedom. The ocean was breathtaking. Hours passed as they weaved through limestone cliffs and empty lagoons. Rudy occasionally pointed out landmarks, Komodo dragons, a hidden bay. But as the sun began to dip, the boat veered sharply off the charted route. Rudy announced a final, secret stop, one last beach. It's very special. No name. We don't tell many. The boat slowed as a small, forested island came into view. It had no dock, just a patch of sand between dense jungle. Swim across, Rudy said, tossing Jack a dry bag. We wait offshore. You explore. We return in 2 hours. Jack hesitated. No signal. Rudy laughed. This is nature, my friend. Go. You will not forget this place. Something about the way he said it, like a promise and a warning, sent a chill down Jack's spine. But the water was warm, the island beautiful. He took the bag and dove in, kicking through the sea until he reached the shore. When he stood, dripping, and turned back, the boat was gone. He scanned the horizon. Nothing. He shouted. No answer. His heart pounded, but he told himself they were playing a prank or scouting deeper waters. He'd wait. But the sun kept sinking, the tide kept pulling, and the silence grew. Jack was alone. Jack stood ankle-deep in the water, watching the last ripple of wake disappear where the boat had been. The horizon was clear. No boat. No sails. No noise. Just wind moving through the trees behind him like a whisper trying to say something he couldn't understand. He laughed nervously, convincing himself they were coming back. They had to be. Maybe they went to refuel or grab supplies. But then, why not say so? Why lie about waiting offshore? He wiped seawater from his eyes and turned back to the island. If he was going to be stuck for a couple of hours, he might as well explore. He followed a narrow path through the palms, sand clinging to his wet feet, expecting to find remnants of past tourists or maybe some kind of old shack, but the deeper he walked, the more untouched the island became. No signs of life. No rappers. No footprints. No sound, except for the crunch of leaves under his feet. It was too perfect. Too still. He pulled out his phone and checked. No signal. No bars. No Wi-Fi. He tried again, holding it high toward the trees like a desperate torch. Nothing. He opened the GPS. The screen loaded, then froze. A blue dot blinked. Surrounded by grey. No roads. No labels. Just a blank patch of ocean where land clearly existed. He refreshed the app. Still nothing. That's when unease started to grow into fear. Jack turned back toward the beach to wait, but hours passed. The sun drifted lower, the colors in the sky turning from soft orange to bruised purple. Still no boat. His dry bag had snacks and water, but only enough for a day. The shadows from the trees stretched longer now, pointing toward him like accusing fingers. He kept scanning the water, squinting for movement, but the sea was empty. Then he thought he heard something. A splash. A footstep. He stood up, heart pounding, eyes darting across the edge of the jungle. Nothing moved. He yelled again, louder this time. "Rudy! Hello!" The silence that answered him was heavy. It pressed against his chest. He grabbed a stick from the forest floor. It wasn't much, but it felt better than being empty-handed. As the night crept in, Jack built a fire with dried palm leaves and broken branches. The glow was small but gave him comfort. The forest behind him remained black. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made him turn his head sharply. He sat awake for hours, eyes darting, ears straining. But nothing ever came out of the jungle. It was like the island was waiting. At sunrise, Jack's face was pale, his clothes damp with sweat and sea breeze. He ran to the waterline hoping the boat would be there, bobbing in the distance like a forgotten promise. But the ocean was just as empty. With the morning light, he decided to walk the perimeter of the island. Maybe there was a hut. Maybe another cove where fishermen docked. He followed the coastline for what felt like hours. The island was larger than it looked. The trees grew denser, more tangled, with thick vines hanging like ropes from above. At one point, he thought he saw a shape, a man maybe, standing far down the beach. Jack called out, waving both arms. But the figure didn't move. When he got closer, he realized it was just a jagged rock, broken in the shape of a person. His heart sank again. He sat down on a fallen log and closed his eyes, trying to breathe, to stay calm. That's when he noticed the sound again. A soft thumping. Faint, like footsteps. But they were irregular. Slow. Then fast. Then stopping altogether. He froze, holding his breath. The sound came from behind, deep in the trees. He turned quickly. Nothing. But the leaves swayed in a direction the wind hadn't touched. He stepped backward toward the water. The feeling of being watched was no longer just a feeling, it felt real. Like eyes were behind the bark, peeking through the green. Watching him the way people watch something about to happen. Jack made a choice. He wouldn't wait anymore. If they weren't coming for him, he had to do something. The island couldn't be that big. There had to be a way off. But before he could think about building a raft or sending a signal, he had to understand what this place was, and why it wasn't on any map. And he had to do it fast. Because something told him the island didn't like visitors. And maybe it never intended to let him leave. The third day began with Jack waking up to the sound of a branch snapping in the forest behind him. His small fire had burned out overnight, and a trail of disturbed leaves seemed to lead away from his makeshift camp. He shot up and looked around, skin prickling with dread. Something had been close. He hadn't imagined the sounds last night. He knew it now. He didn't even eat, just grabbed his stick, his bag, and started walking inland. If something, or someone, was sharing this island with him, he needed to find out who, or what, before it found him first. As he pushed deeper into the jungle, the terrain changed. The trees were older here, thick trunks wrapped in spiraling vines. The ground felt damp, and the light barely reached through the green ceiling above. That's when Jack saw the first one. A symbol, carved into the bark of a tree. It was circular, with jagged lines through the center, almost like a broken eye. He stared at it, unsure if it was natural, or just some twisted coincidence in the wood. But then he saw another. And another. Soon, every tree in sight bore the same strange symbol, each one carefully carved with something sharp. Some had dried flowers or bones hanging from the branches. Others had feathers tied with old rope. It didn't feel like art. It felt like a warning. He reached out to touch one of the carvings but stopped when a loud screech echoed from above. A large bird flew off from the treetops, but the sound wasn't what scared him, it was the timing. It felt like something didn't want him to touch that tree. He took a few steps back and moved around it. Deeper in the forest, the air felt heavier. Like the island itself was breathing. The silence was broken only by distant, low hums, not mechanical, but human. Rhythmic. Chant-like. He froze, crouched, and listened. The sound faded in and out, like waves. It was coming from the northeast part of the island. He moved quietly now, each step deliberate, scanning the dense green for movement. That's when he saw a new kind of marker, not a carving, but an arrangement of stones in a perfect spiral on the ground. In the center was a pile of ash, still faintly warm. Someone had been there recently. Jack's heart pounded. He wasn't alone. He followed the direction the hum had come from, staying close to the thickest parts of the foliage. Then he saw something that stopped him cold. In a small clearing, there was a totem, a tall wooden post carved with faces stacked on top of each other, mouths wide open in silent screams. Around it were hanging objects, masks, beads, bones. And beside it, stuck into the ground like a grave marker, was a modern item, a hiking boot. Mud-caked, torn, and old. He moved closer and saw initials burned into the leather. They weren't his. This wasn't left by accident. Someone had come here before him. Maybe others. And they hadn't left. Jack stepped back, his breathing shallow. He turned to leave and caught movement from the corner of his eye, not a shadow, not a trick of light, but a person. Just beyond the trees. He whipped around, eyes scanning. Nothing there. But he was sure he'd seen someone. They had ducked behind a tree. He ran forward, yelling, "Hey! I'm stuck here. I need help." No answer. Just the swaying of the trees. He searched the area, heart pounding, mouth dry. The jungle was too thick, and whoever it was had vanished. Either they didn't want to be found, or they were never really meant to be seen. Back at the beach, Jack began marking the trees himself. He made tall arrows with driftwood and spelled out SOS with rocks near the shore. He needed to do something, anything, to try to get rescued. But as night fell again, the island turned sinister. The trees rustled with unseen movements. Strange tapping echoed from the jungle like someone knocking on the trunks. And then came the whisper. Not wind. Not his mind. A real whisper. Close. He sat near his fire, eyes wide, ears sharp. At one point he heard breathing behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing. Just the dark forest swallowing up the night. He knew now the island wasn't empty. But whatever lived there didn't speak. It watched. It followed. It whispered without words. The symbols were messages, warnings maybe, or a language. And as crazy as it sounded, Jack was starting to think the island didn't want him to leave. Or worse, it wanted him to stay. By the fifth night, Jack had started losing track of time. The days bled into each other with no schedule, no phone, no idea when or if the boat would ever return. His face was sunburned, his hands scratched from thorns, and his voice hoarse from yelling into the empty sea. But it wasn't just the physical strain that wore him down. It was the feeling of being watched. Followed. Measured. He barely slept now, dozing in fits beside a low-burning fire, clutching a sharpened stick in one hand like it was a sword. Every time the wind shifted or the branches cracked, he sat up with a jolt. The jungle wasn't just alive. It was aware. That night, just after midnight, he saw something that finally stripped away all hope that this was just a strange accident. It started with a flicker of orange in the distance, a glow beyond the trees, pulsing like firelight. Jack stood and moved toward it, silently weaving through the underbrush. As he got closer, the flicker turned into a steady flame. Then he heard it again, humming. Low, layered voices blending together, humming a tune without melody. He dropped to his knees, crawling the final stretch until he reached a ridge overlooking a sunken clearing. What he saw below made his stomach twist. There were people. At least a dozen of them. Barefoot, covered in mud and white ash. They circled a fire pit in slow motion, arms raised, swaying in silence. Some wore carved wooden masks with twisted expressions. Others had smeared symbols across their chests with what looked like blood. At the center of their ritual stood a tall figure in a cloak made from palm leaves, holding a staff with bones dangling from it. No one spoke. They moved like they'd done this forever, like each movement held meaning Jack couldn't begin to understand. This wasn't a rescue team. This wasn't a tribe. This was something else. He crouched lower, heart slamming against his ribs. Every part of his brain screamed to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He watched as the tall figure pointed toward a large wooden post driven into the ground, another totem with screaming faces carved into it. Two of the others dragged something toward it. A shape. A bundle of fabric. Jack leaned forward and saw it was a person, barely conscious, tied at the hands and ankles, struggling weakly. The others pushed them against the totem and began wrapping vines around their body to keep them upright. Jack's blood ran cold. He tried to convince himself it was a play, a performance, something for tourists. But there was no audience. No cameras. Just firelight and silence. Suddenly, one of the masked figures turned its head sharply, right toward the ridge. Jack ducked down and didn't breathe. He waited for footsteps, for shouts, but none came. When he peeked again, the masked figure had turned back to the fire. But Jack knew what he saw. That turn wasn't random. They had sensed him. They knew he was close. He belly-crawled backward through the brush, holding in every breath, until he was far enough to stand. Then he ran. He ran through the trees, scratched by branches, stumbling over roots, not stopping until he was back at his beach camp. By dawn, he was shaking. Not from fear. From a terrifying realization. He wasn't just stuck on this island. He was part of something. Part of a pattern. The rituals, the symbols, the offerings, they weren't random. He thought back to the boot he'd found near the totem. The journals. The carvings. The others who came before him. He hadn't been forgotten. He had been left. Left on purpose. He started checking every inch of the forest during the day. Looking for clues, for a path, for anything he might have missed. That's when he found a stone wall, almost hidden behind layers of moss and vines. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries. On the wall was a mural. Dozens of faceless figures circling a fire, just like the ones Jack had seen the night before. And beneath it, a single figure kneeling, arms raised, vines wrapped around them. Jack stared at the mural for a long time. It wasn't art. It was history. As night approached again, he knew he had to make a choice. He could stay and hide, waiting for something to find him. Or he could find them first. Confront them. Ask the one question that burned in his head. Why me? Why now? What was this place? What did they want from him? The island had a rhythm. A cycle. He could feel it in the ground. And he wasn't sure if he was caught in the middle of it, or if he had been chosen to complete it. Jack spent most of the day building something that resembled a spear. He used a sharp rock he had hammered into the end of a broken oar, binding it with thin vines. It wasn't a weapon that could stop a group, but it made him feel like he wasn't completely defenseless. The faces from the night before haunted him. Not just because of what they were doing, but because of how calm they all looked, like they'd done it before, and like it all made perfect sense to them. He kept hearing that low humming in his head, over and over, even though it was silent now. He hadn't seen the person tied to the totem again. He didn't know if they were still alive. But he couldn't stop thinking one day it might be him. He stayed hidden for most of the day, moving only when the light filtered down strong enough for him to spot clear paths through the forest. He noticed more markers now, as if they had been there the whole time but only became visible after the ritual. Bone fragments tied in knots, small cloth dolls hanging from branches, long trails of powder across the dirt that seemed to glow under the sun. As Jack followed them deeper into the island, he stumbled upon a small wooden structure, mostly buried under leaves and thyme. Inside, he found proof he wasn't the first. A box with old notebooks, their covers worn and pages water-stained. Each one held fragments from others before him, different languages, different handwriting, all saying the same thing: they watch, don't trust the boat, this island doesn't forget, and one that stopped him cold: if you're reading this, you've been chosen. The pages told different stories, but the ending was always the same. People arrived here thinking they were on a trip. Some were lured with promises of paradise. Some claimed the boat circled back after a few days, not to rescue them, but to drop off the next person. One journal had a crude map of the island and a message scribbled over and over: it's not just a ritual. It's a cycle. Jack sat there for a long time, gripping the journal with shaking hands. He wasn't lost. He was part of something bigger. Something ancient. The tour company wasn't careless, it was deliberate. Night fell again too fast. He built his fire larger this time, like a wall between him and the forest. But it didn't stop the drums. Not real drums, but steady thumping sounds that echoed from deep within the jungle. Not mechanical, not animal. Human. They started slow, then built into a rhythm that set his heart racing without reason. He backed away from the fire, spear in hand, listening. That's when he saw them again. The figures. At the edge of the trees. Watching. No masks now. Just faces, still and blank, like they weren't sure if they were people or something else pretending to be. He stepped toward them, trembling. "Why me?" he yelled. "Why are you doing this?" No one answered. But they didn't run. They didn't move. One of them finally lifted a hand and pointed toward the sea. Jack turned and saw it, the boat. The same one from the day he arrived, floating silently just beyond the reef. No motor, no crew visible, no lights. Just waiting. He sprinted to the shore, screaming for help. But as he got closer, he saw something that shattered the last bit of hope inside him. There was someone already on the boat, a young man, confused, waving, calling out, just like Jack had when he first arrived. And standing beside him was Rudy, smiling the same fake smile, pointing toward the island and telling the boy what he once told Jack: "This is a special place. You'll never forget it." Jack fell to his knees in the sand. The boat was never coming back for him. It never had. It was just part of the cycle. A system, running again and again, feeding the island whatever it demanded. Sacrifice, fear, something ancient Jack couldn't name. He turned to the tree line and the figures were gone. But he knew they weren't far. They were always watching. As the sun dipped below the water, Jack whispered to himself, not a prayer, but a truth: I was chosen. The others hadn't been wrong. This island had a memory, a purpose. And now, he was part of it. The boat disappeared into the horizon, just as it had the day Jack arrived. Only this time, he knew the script. He had become part of the pattern. Another link in the chain. As night took over the sky, he didn't bother with a fire. He sat on the beach in silence, watching the waves lap against the shore, gentle and endless. The island no longer felt like a place, it felt like a presence. Like it breathed with him, or maybe through him. He wondered if it could think. If it remembered everyone it had claimed. The others who had left their journals, their warnings, their bones. The more he tried to make sense of it all, the less he understood. There were no answers. Just rituals. Rhythms. Repetition. The boat always returned, but never for the same person. The next morning, Jack stopped running. He stopped searching. Something in him had shifted. The panic, the begging, the hope, it all burned out. In its place was focus. He didn't want to die here, but more than that, he didn't want to disappear like the others. If this island wanted a sacrifice, it would have to fight for it. He started building. Not a raft. Not really. More like a floating box made from logs, tied with vines, lined with palm bark to hold his weight. He'd spent enough days walking the shoreline to know where the currents pulled. He figured if he pushed out at sunrise, he might have a chance before the tide dragged him back or the island noticed he was gone. It took him 2 days to finish it. During that time, he stayed away from the jungle. The figures didn't come close, but he felt them more than ever. The whispers were louder. The dreams were worse. Each night, he saw faces in the fire. Not his own. Strangers. People before him. Crying, screaming, then silent. On the final night, just before dawn, he sat by the water's edge and whispered goodbye, not to anyone, but to the part of himself that believed he'd ever get justice. No one was coming for him. The only person who could save Jack now was Jack. He launched the raft at sunrise. The sky was soft and gold, the wind low, the sea calm. He paddled with a broken board, pushing against the waves with everything he had. At first, the island faded behind him. For the first time in over a week, he smiled. He imagined floating to a fishing boat, or a nearby island, or maybe just far enough that someone, anyone, would spot him. But then the water changed. The calm gave way to a slow roll, like something large moving beneath. The sky darkened slightly, clouds forming from nowhere. and from the trees far behind him, a sound rose. Not screaming. Not drums. A low, bone-deep hum that rattled his chest. The raft jerked. Not from the waves, but like something had grabbed it. He turned, heart racing, but saw nothing. Still, the pull grew stronger. He fought it, paddling harder, but the water pushed him back, not sideways, not with the tide, but back toward the island. No matter how hard he fought, it was like an invisible cord tied to his waist, yanking him in reverse. His arms burned. His throat screamed. But the island grew larger. The trees clearer. The fire pit now visible from the shore. He had failed. By the time he collapsed back on the sand, the sky had returned to its calm blue. The waves gentle once more. But Jack lay there, face down, knowing now what no one else had. The island didn't need ropes or chains. It had a will. It decided who stayed and who left. And it had chosen him again. That night, there were no whispers. No drums. Just silence. Too quiet. Jack walked through the trees with no fear. If the island wanted him, it could take him. But he wasn't going to run anymore. He returned to the clearing where the rituals had taken place, now cold and empty. He stood at the center of the circle, arms by his sides, and looked up at the stars. And then he heard footsteps. Real ones. Heavy. Behind him. He turned and saw the cloaked figure again. The one with the staff. The others stood behind him in a wide arc, their faces visible now. Jack stepped forward and asked again, "Why me?" The figure raised a hand and pointed toward Jack's chest, then toward the sea. A gesture, simple and strange. As if saying he had come from the ocean and would one day return to it. Jack didn't speak. He just nodded. Maybe there was no meaning. Or maybe he was never supposed to understand it. When morning came, Jack was alone again. No figures. No sounds. But on the sand next to him lay something new, a conch shell, tied with red thread, placed where his head had rested. He picked it up slowly, unsure what it meant. A gift. A curse. He didn't know. But the island had left it, and that meant something. That meant it was watching. Always. As he stared out at the sea once more, he realized the island never forgot its own. It marked them. Held them. Kept them in its story. And whether he escaped one day or vanished like the others, one thing was certain. Jack Monroe would never truly leave. Because some places don't just trap the body. They trap the soul.